Good evening, everyone. I'm just going to give it a minute and then we'll get started. As always, just please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. Complete the check-in form if you haven't done so already. And as we go out the presentation, put any questions or comments in the chat. Both of our TAs will be monitoring that, and there'll be time for some questions at the end. All right, so let's get started. As always, these are just the Zoom participant controls. You're going to be muted, so you can't unmute yourself during the presentation, but when we get to the Q&A portion at the end, you will be able to. If you're on a phone line, please remember to mute yourself. As always, I'm Zoe Harris, and then I'm joined by Wendy, Marjorie, and Nanzani. Just really briefly about the course for people that haven't been here. So this is a UIC course, and for some background, it was created by Student Leadership in Radical Public Health, which is a student group here, and it's now sponsored by the Collaboratory for Health Justice, where we're trying to bring community voices to the forefront across SPH, and you can find more information about the Collaboratory on their website. So for today's lecture, we do have some material that can be difficult to discuss, so if at any point you feel like you need to step away from the presentation, please do so. Really quickly, here's our land acknowledgement, and also want to say happy Black History Month and happy Lunar New Year to the people that do celebrate it. So as always, the University of Illinois at Chicago stands on the original homelands of the Miami Three Fires people, the Ojibwe, Idaho, and Potawatomi, who have been stewards of this land for generations. Illinois is also home to a diverse Native community of more than 75,000 tribal members, many of whom live in the Chicago area. And for those who are not currently residing in Chicago, we encourage you to look into the Indigenous people of your own lands. And finally, what we are here for. So today we are joined by Ms. Washieka Torres, who's a disability rights scholar, activist, and documentarian. She's from the South Bronx in New York City and is currently a third-year PhD student in the Disability Studies program here at UIC. She's a documentarian, researcher, and public speaker. Her work explores the intersections of poverty, disability, food insecurity, and food justice. Her current projects focus on disabled cooking methods, meaning, and knowledge translation. So without further ado, Ms. Washieka Torres. Yay.
Hi, everyone. I'm really glad to be here. For anyone who took the course or saw videos last year, I also did a presentation in the same realm of disability studies, but in with a different topic. So I'm really excited that all of you are here to hear me speak, and I can't wait to see the recording of this to see how well it goes. I'm just also being interested in taking a screenshot of how many people are here because I'm super excited. So I will actually share my screen right now, and we will go into our, I will just share sound for no reason. There's no sound on this. Let's start my slideshow. And then this image here that you see actually does have an image description. If you right click on the PowerPoint, and if you need to download the PowerPoint, you can always ask the instructors of the course. So this class is titled Health Equity for Everybody. I actually absolutely love an emphasis on all bodies and equity. So the agenda, I always like to have an agenda. When I speak, it really does help me to stay on task, and it helps keep me accountable in all ways. And so what we're going to do is a bit of introduction about myself, talk a little bit more about the points that were mentioned earlier, talk kind of about what is disability, and then the ways in which disability is inequitable in various systems. So, levels of access, the legal system, health access, prisons and the carceral system, and then also food access. And then we will wrap up, and I will share my sources. There is something else that I did see that does tie into other things around carceral systems and food. And if you'd like that, it's fine. But there was also some readings that were suggested that I handed in. If anyone has questions about that as well, let me know. So here we go. So my name is Washieka Torres. That's my full name. I generally go by Miss Torres. I don't have any kind of pronouns. I use all of them. They're fine. For me, I'm a fourth year PhD student here at USC in the Disability Studies program, which is pretty unique because it's one of the few that are kind of standalone. It's not connected to another department. It's its own interdisciplinary department. So I'm really happy that I was able to um, be able to just get directly into this program as opposed to going through other arenas and then looking at disability studies kind of as an offshoot so I can kind of focus my work. I am a documentarian. I did a documentary on disability in Mississippi. If anyone would like an access to that, I can give you my email and just send you a link. I have a YouTube page that actually is called Creating Equitable Media, and that's what it works on. And the point of that production company is to not only have disabled people be the subject of documentaries where they're centered, but all aspects of it. So the writing, the brainstorming, the editing, the production, all of those things in order to create more equitable opportunities for disabled people in various points of media and allow them to use these experiences to hone their skills and work in media in a way that's comfortable for them and to know what their access needs are through the production process from the very beginning until the very end. I'm also an activist. I was a disability rights activist before I became a scholar in New York for over a decade now. I have been a disability rights activist, and it has been an amazing experience, very humbling experience, where people have been telling me their stories and letting me know who they are. And that's a really important part of being an activist, that you are not just driven by some inner passion, but you are driven by those who are experiencing these things, who know what they need, and you center those people and you build these beautiful lifelong connections. And I've also written a number of grants. I'm very happy to say I have gotten a number of grants as well. It's not just written them, mainly focusing on disability and access and different types of equitable access, whether that's social access or financial or other kinds of information. I do other public speaking engagements such as this. I have one in a few weeks with Harper College, but that is, I believe that's mostly for students. That does talk about supermarket access and different ways that supermarkets are other areas where many able-bodied consumers, there's an assumption that there is access, but there isn't, and how to explore and investigate and change that. I'm also a teacher. I'm a teaching assistant for DHD 101, which is Introduction to Disability Studies. I also teach a class called Reimagining Bodies at the School of Art Institute at Chicago, and we look at representations of disability in life, how that is depicted in art, disabled artists, disability art, which is not necessarily, they're not necessarily the same thing as one another, and the choices that disabled artists make in their work to either translate disability or to depict disability in some way. And overall, I'm an educator. I really love educating people on different topics. I love educating people on the different things I've learned, whether it's about disability or whether it's about race or gender or class or identity. So I'm extremely happy to be able to be here and share that knowledge with you all. So what is disability? So according to the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was signed in 1990 and then renewed again in the 2000s, the early 2000s, so I believe it was like 2008 or 9, there were like renewals, extensions, more explanations that were added onto the act. Disability is a mental or a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities of such individuals. And there are two big models of disability. So the one that many people, especially those in medical or clinical fields, are familiar with would be seen as, I have no idea what's going on with my screen or why it's writing, please ignore that, is the medical model. And so that is kind of where disability is located exclusively in the individual body. And the body requires treatment or correction or cure. And if someone is disabled, it is seen more as a personal or moral failing overall, rather than something that is outside of their body. And they should want to be cured and fixed in these other things. But then there's the social model, which came about in the later on in the second half of the 20th century, with many scholars saying that no, the disability is a condition external to the body, right? It is these social organizations, the symptoms, these institutional practices, these environmental structures. There is not a physical failing within my body, right? There is an impairment that I may have, but I am not the problem. It is that society has made choices where I'm either invisibilized, right, where I'm put away in an institution because people don't want to see or deal with disability, or because the structures that are in place currently are not accessible to me, right? I want to go to school, I want to go to this building, but it has stairs and there's no ramp, or they put a ramp, but it's not safe or it's not up to code. For instance, there are buildings, their building codes were saying buildings need to have elevators, correct? Well, in Chicago, if a building is not more than 3 stories, it doesn't have to be. So there are a lot of new construction going on. I live on the west side. There's a lot of construction going on with these quote unquote smart homes, and they're 3 stories, and you need stairs to get in. There's stairs going up to the first floor. And they're built obviously after the ADA has been passed, but because of these rules and the fact that people see them as expensive or unnecessary, that is shutting out a huge percentage of people. There are about 20% of people in the US, at least, that have disabilities, and that number is growing. And we will talk about there are people who are born with disabilities, but then there are people who acquire disabilities, whether through age or through their environment. We talked about last year in Epidemics of Injustice, there was a recording about environmental justice and how the environment creates disability. There are many institutions that create disability or exacerbate disability and make it worse. And so by having less housing available for disabled people, the housing they do have may not be the housing they need or want. And so there are a lot of ways in which, and there are other models. There's like the cultural model, which looks at how disability and the way we see disability, even through the medical model, just culturally, it's a cultural idea. And the idea of this very Western idea of strict independence is a cultural idea, and that is how the social and medical models manifest. But in other cultures where interdependence is seen as critical to a social structure, the idea of disability may be very different. So the social model likes to reflect, explore, and assess the gaps in equity and access, right? And again, I do want to say that the social model is not against medicine. Medicine is not the problem. The problem is that people are seen solely and entirely as their disability. And they're seen as, needing to be fixed or incomplete people because they are disabled or impaired. And that is clearly not the case. But because they are not seen as complete people, sometimes they're infantilized, they are desexualized, they're over-sexualized, people paternalize them. So the access they get because they are treated, less than as full people with rights that they've been, given or that they have taken, right? If we think about the 504 sit-ins, rights that they have taken for themselves, we can kind of see that there's these gaps because of this idea of what a disabled person looks like, moves like, needs, and wants. So when we explore through the social model, which many people in disability studies look at, social model, culture model, things like that, we see that because of these gaps in equity and access, there are physical limitations to institutions of higher learning. I talked about colleges. There are some colleges that are extremely old. There are colleges in the US that are older than the US, right? If you think about some Ivy Leagues or some other types of colleges, and those buildings are extremely old. Some have been updated and some are what they call grandfathered in, meaning that they are not making updates to any kind of system. It's going to be the way it is, and that is just the way it is. Places of employment. Some places, depending on the buildings they're housed in or depending on the types of elevators they have or the type of repairs or maintenance they make, people may have limited physical access to those places. Houses of worship are actually exempt from in the ADA, so you can see churches that have stairs and they're not accessible to all patrons. And that is a shame because there are people who at one point maybe they were not disabled or not impaired in any way, and now they cannot go to the churches they've worshiped at for so long, and now they don't see themselves as a full member of this church, and they cannot fully access institutions on their own terms, right? And then we will see areas of leisure. So a lot of times you will see people talk about schools or employment, houses of worship, things like that. And that's important. But disabled people like to enjoy leisurely activities too, right? Going to the movies, going to the beach, going to the pool, going to these other places, concerts or other areas that may not be accessible, or accessibility may come with a lot of steps that are just, there are just so many more steps to go through. I can give you an example. So I'm from New York, as I said before. I went to a concert at Carnegie. I wanted to go to a concert with a friend of mine at Carnegie Mall. My friend's in a wheelchair and has limited lower body mobility. And initially, thankfully, we did go to Carnegie Hall beforehand to look at the space, and we let them know, because what has to happen is you have to call them almost a month in advance. You have to physically, you had to call at the time. There was no way to do this online, because they have to see what seats you're getting. They have to give you a special set of seats in the area you want, but you can't fully pick your seat. It has to be at the end of the aisle, because they have to remove the chair, because the chairs are not, when Carnegie Hall was built, right? And even through the updates, the chairs are not accessible for people in wheelchairs. So the areas you can sit in, you can only sit near the aisles, and hopefully no one's hitting you on the way there or back from where they're going. And they have to physically take out the chair you're sitting in. And if that's not the view you want, that's the view you're going to get, because there's specific areas you can sit, and there's only specific places within those areas that you can sit. And you have to call in advance. And that is the only way my friend and I were able to enjoy this concert we wanted to go to. Other times there are special accommodations. There's a form you need to fill out, or if you want to go to the movies and you want to get captions, there are devices you get, but if they're not charged or don't have batteries, now you don't have access to a film, or there are no audio descriptions of something, or they're really bad because it was just done as an afterthought. So when someone who may be able-bodied in some ways are at a film, or I have friends who are epileptic, and there'll be movies that have a lot of flashing and bright lights, and people are not told beforehand, that is causing a medical emergency, and that is socially ostracizing people who were just there to enjoy a leisurely activity. Thankfully, online, a lot of people will put warnings saying, hi, just letting you all know this movie trailer, whatever, has these scenes. So if you have sensitivities to light or sound or something like that, please know that, so that you don't watch this. There is, let me warn you, so that nothing is triggered, and that you are still okay. I do a lot of things around transit. So transit routes, if you think about, for instance, a lot of Chicago there's buses, and the CTA website will say all bus stops are accessible. The CTA website is not telling you the truth. There is a bus stop route, and I'm not going to mention it because I am actually afraid they're going to take the stop away altogether, and instead of improving it as they do, that lets you off on the side of a highway. And there is no cut curb. And some sidewalks are like that. There are no cut curbs. So you're going to have to go into the street and hopefully find a way to get to that bus stop. So you're let off on the side of the highway, no cut curbs, and there's no light either. Some bus stops don't have lights. You just have stop signs. So you have to figure out how to make your way across the street, because people are not paying attention to the yield to pedestrian signs or the stop signs, or signs that say like blind and low vision people. If you are ever on Roosevelt in Chicago, along Roosevelt and Wood, there's the Lighthouse for the Blind. And I've interviewed some of the security guards there, and they've said people have just hit people. They've run through the sign, they've hit people and just kept going. And that is horrendous, because that is clearly, and they're where bus stops are. Bus stops, lights, stop signs. Or, like I said, you have train lines that are not accessible. Sometimes they let you know, oh, this train station's elevator is broken, but sometimes you just have to find out by going there. I was on the Red Line. I was at Roosevelt. It was the Roosevelt stop on the Red Line. I needed to go uptown. I had a shopping cart. Someone else was in a wheelchair. The elevator didn't work. There was no sign anywhere. There was nothing written anywhere. And the person had to leave that station and then go find another station to go to, which who knows if that station will even work. So these things are not kept up to date. And then they'll try to update stations, and they'll make these huge upgrades but won't include access in their upgrades, which they are supposed to legally, right? And so all of these, right, all these types of physical access limits, right? Let's think about, like, if we're just looking at the physicality of the landscape of Chicago, it is snowing. These sidewalks are not shoveled. Some of the streets, depending on the neighborhood you're in, the streets are not plowed. Like my street did not get plowed. So even when the weather's nice, if disabled people have to go in the street, but if the weather's worse, how are you even getting out of your home? How are you managing to go down the block to get to a store that may or may not be open because of the snow or inclement weather? So all of these limits, these physical access limits, they will impact the way in which disabled people are seen and considered equitable members of society. You're not going to, if you don't see a lot of people, disabled people at the movie theater, you're thinking, oh, they probably don't go to the movies or they watch movies from home. No, the issue is that they don't have access to these spaces, right? They don't have equitable access to the spaces so that they can have full enjoyment of them. You're not seeing disabled people in church. Oh, well, maybe they go to a different church. Maybe they do because they don't have a choice, right? The limiting of choices, unnecessary limiting of choices, I may add, has a huge impact on people's quality of life. Next. So there are issues, if anybody's familiar, a lot of people are familiar with the Britney Spears situation of guardianship. There was also a talk by, oh my goodness, what is his name? John Oliver, where he talked about issues around guardianship. And so guardianship pretty much is saying the court or legal system has ruled that you cannot be in charge of your own financial, social, recreational decisions. So someone else who is more qualified will do that. And most people are familiar with the case of Britney Spears and then her father having guardianship and controlling her finances and other types of decisions when it came to her life. But this happens for so many disabled people. And one of the big problems, besides the fact that this person's quality of life is diminished because they do not have access to finances, they don't get to make their own decisions on where they want to go or live or want to do. But you will often have people who are guardians of a number of people at once, right? Because they get money from this. They accrue a lot of money without actually doing the services they were told. They will write down they did a service and they don't do it, right? They are just taking money from a lot of disabled people who need it themselves. And I have often, there's actually another author that says that disabled people don't make a lot of money. They often live in poverty, but disability as an industry is worth so much money. Rehabilitation centers get a lot of money, hospitals and other things, nursing homes, other types of institutions and facilities will get a lot of money from a disabled person that they never see themselves. And this is just another instance of them not being in charge of their own lives and livelihood. And it definitely diminishes their quality of life. So legal rights to income and savings. So if you have a particular type of health insurance or certain services, you can't have a certain amount of money in the bank and or you can't make a certain amount of money with employment or you will lose those services. There are certain plans that you can use, like a savings income account that you can use, but you can't have more than a certain amount of money in your bank account, which the levels are in like the thousands. So imagine having to pay bills or even wanting to invest in getting a home. How are you going to save to put a down payment on a home, especially an accessible home, which might be more, or one that has to be like a modular home, which are usually less expensive and can be modified to be made, on ground level, more accessible for you. When you can't even have that amount of money in the bank, or you have to have a special savings account for those things, or you will lose critical services that you need to survive in the right now. Being able to invest and plan for the future financially is so important, but it's something that is denied to you because you will lose these other services and you don't have this safety net because we'll go to there in a minute about low employment rates. But there's also ramifications to marriage. And this conversation comes up every so often, but it also comes up with regards to marriage equality. And people were really excited for that. I was as well. But a lot of disabled people were saying, well, if I get married to my disabled partner, I lose my benefits. Like we will both lose our benefits because now there's this idea that we make too much, or they assume that this person will be my caregiver, which is a poor assumption, obviously. But there are a lot of disabled people who are not married, but they live together and they're lifelong partners because they will lose so many benefits. They will not be able to survive on whatever income they'd be able to scrap together. Low employment rates. are a huge issue, and that is tracked by the Bureau of Labor, and you can see that no matter what the unemployment rate is for disabled people, it is often way lower. It'll be double in terms of the unemployment. Sorry, it'll be way higher. It'll be double, if not more. And the pandemic actually has, made that a lot more critical, giving people more excuses not to hire disabled people. And often when they're hired, they will start off with lower wages and have less opportunities for promotions or salary increases, doing the same job, even if they don't need accommodations on the job because of the perception that, oh, they're going to do less, they're going to be sick more, they're going to be less productive. All of these ableist assumptions about their bodies and what their bodies can do and how much their bodies can produce for whomever they're working for. There's also something else a lot of people don't know about called sheltered workshops. So these workshops often will have disabled people, generally people with intellectual disabilities, working, and they make small things like wallets or just small things. Some work in other places, such as like you'll see disabled people who work at like Goodwill or something like that, or Goodwill says, or certain agencies will also say, oh, well, we hire disabled people. And the question is, okay, but are you paying them an equitable wage? And the answer is no. Oftentimes they're being paid less than minimum wage, and there's forms you can file with the government and things like that to pay them less than a minimum wage. Because they're saying, oh, well, they'll need assistance, so we'd have to hire someone else anyway. And all of these other rationales that are pretty much just saying you aren't worth the same as an able-bodied person. And so we will not be paying you the same as an able-bodied person, but we still expect you to work. And clearly, these aspects, these legal barriers, these employment barriers, income and financial, and also marriage and societal barriers also will have an impact on your quality of life and your standing as you want to be seen as an equitable member of society. Well, it will also have an impact on that quality of life. So health access. So Medicaid and Medicare, those are two systems that disabled people can access. One of the big issues, and it's funny enough, John Oliver actually talked about this as well, is the privatization of these services. And what will often happen with these services? Well, one big issue before privatization, before we get into that, is that a lot of decisions are made, how do I say, there's a term called street level bureaucrats. It is kind of not the person who makes the law, but the person who is making these determinations. So for instance, I use SNAP, right? And there's a determination of if I qualify for SNAP. On paper, yes, I qualify. I meet the income requirements. I meet the whatever requirements are on paper, I meet them. But I'll file and I'll go to the office. And that person makes that determination whether I will get my application approved or denied. That person is not the federal official who wrote that. That person can look on paper and say, well, technically you qualified here, but I don't think you're qualified here. I don't believe you're qualified here. Or could you submit this paperwork or that paperwork? Every year, well, you have to they check every like 6 months, but they call you every year. And this one woman was asking me questions that you're not allowed to ask someone who is a SNAP recipient who's renewing. There's just certain questions that you don't need to ask, but if you do not answer them, they will deny you. And you will have to go through an appeal process. And then through the appeal process, you may or may not win, and that may take time. And in that process, you don't have money for food, or you don't have money for the medicines you need, or the operations, or to see the doctors you need. And there's a system of gatekeeping where, are you disabled enough to get these services? Right? Because if you're too disabled, it will put you in an institution, and Medicaid and Medicare will pay out to those institutions, right? But if you're disabled enough to get it and not be in an institution, we're going to give you a hard time approving all these other costs and all these other needs for you. And so oftentimes, a lot of these services, you do need assistance from a non-disabled person to navigate the like web of information you need, or you need to know someone who is familiar with these laws and these policies, who know exactly how to navigate those systems. Privatization, a lot of these systems are going to be privatized or getting into that privatization. And I'm not going to mince words here. Privatization kills people. And one of the ways it does that is by reassessing the services people need. I was actually reading this report by AARP where they were saying that a number of people who get these services aren't getting enough services. it's insufficient, the amount of services they're already getting. And with privatization, they redetermine, okay, well, do you really need this service? Do you need this many hours? Does it need to cost this much? And they'll say, okay, well, instead of getting $20 an hour through us to pay for a home health aide, you're only going to get 15. Or you're only going to get, instead of getting 30 hours a week, you're going to get 15. Or oh, well, someone lives with you, that person can care for you even if they have a job. So now we're cutting off those services. Or, oh, you need paratransit. Well, we need definitive proof that you cannot take any part of the transit system. In New York, the MTA has Access-a-Ride, and what they've started to do a lot of is Access-a-Ride will take you to the nearest, to a train station or to a bus stop. If I could take the fixed route system, which is what most transit systems are called, I would have taken the fixed route system. But I cannot take the fixed route system to get where I have to go. And now you're leaving me at a bus stop. I have no idea if this is even the correct bus stop. And now I'm late, or I'm going to miss something, or I go in the wrong direction. I have no idea where I am. So privatization in that case will deny, delay, or diminish the services that people have found critical to being able to live outside of institutions or facilities and live the life that they want to live on their terms without having to rely on family members. There's some people who do live in families, and families are fine helping here and there, but people should be able to live as interdependently or independently as they want. And privatization really stymies that, their ability to do that. So access to mental health services has been a problem everywhere. I mean, even before the pandemic, access to getting therapy or getting counseling of some kind has been very difficult and or very costly. So even here, a friend of mine, when we entered school, we entered in the fall, so we entered around August. They didn't get any kind of counseling services until that next semester, which was January. And then when I needed some services in like September, I didn't get them till February. So there's this huge list and backlog of people, and then they'll see you for a week, weeks at a time, but then they'll see you every other week, and then they'll see you once a month. And then that means you have to pay for your own services, or certain insurances will say, okay, we'll pay for these therapists, but therapists will say, well, sorry, the wait list is 6 months, or you need to find a psychiatrist, and there's no psychiatrist. Like, we need to have both, whether you actually need both or not. They want you to have both, but you can't find the other. So you can't get one because you can't find the other. And you have to come out of pocket for many of those services, which, because of the other things in the previous slide, are going to be hard to find. Access to competent services. I know now there have been talks and demonstrations at the medical college about how to provide competent services for disabled people. And oftentimes, thankfully, that is happening now, but those will oftentimes be far and few between. I know a lot of people who are autistic who have had particular issues finding competent services to suit their needs. People with various disabilities, especially those with chronic pain, they have been told, I know I've often been told, oh, if you lose weight, there won't be any pain. No, the issue isn't the weight. The issue is this pain is in my body. Or people who are thin, oh, well, you sure you're not exaggerating the pain? No, I'm pretty sure that this pain is the pain that I'm feeling, and I know my body, right? This kind of idea that you don't know or understand what's going on in your body is a huge problem. And not being seen as experts of their own experience. Disabled people, and I'm clapping, disabled people are experts of their own experience. They know when something is wrong in their body. My body functions this way, it does not function this way. I need this, or I need that. When I told my doctor, I'm having issues walking, I'm having this chronic pain issue that stemmed from a number of accidents I've had that I could not afford to go to physical therapy for. I couldn't afford physical therapy. This is not these are not, what are they called? Rhetorical examples. These are actual examples from my life and the life of people I know. So I have to use a cane now. I asked the doctor about going to physical therapy. She said, oh, well, if you lose the weight, there's a lot of weight on you. Thanks so much. I've been fat since I was 8. This is different. Something is wrong with my whole body. Oh, well, maybe if you ate better, maybe if you did this or that. And it's not about not making those changes or having a better quality of life. That's great. But looking at my body and assuming that's my issue is the problem, because now things in my body that were messed up, I didn't get therapy for. My body healed the best it could, and now there are days I can't leave the house. Inflammation is too bad, or other things just I've passed the window for any kind of competent recovery. So now I'm living with this chronic pain every day, and it's just always there, but hopefully it's not getting worse, right? And when I've asked for help, more help, there's different things I'm told, and it's like, oh, well, you don't know what you're talking about. Oh, it's this, oh, it's that. So, and then there's often, if we're talking about COVID, it's gonna get dark here. There are disabled people who are left to die at the hands of the medical and the healthcare system. Whether we're talking about nursing homes that aren't checking on patients and they get really serious infections, that happens a lot. Where people will just be left in beds and they get bed sores or they get something else or something like that. Also, what was recently happening was this kind of quality of life measure. Oh, well, if someone who's disabled comes in with COVID, we're not going to give them access to a bed or to services, life-saving services, because we consider their quality of life to be lesser. Certain people with certain types of disabilities are not put on transplant lists. And I know there's this whole thing about having to get vaccines to be put on transplant lists. There are people, because especially people with Down syndrome, that has been a huge controversy, are not put on transplant lists because their quality of life, oh, this is a life-saving organ and their quality of life is not seen as high. And that is awful. And it is just regrettable. And that is something that has historically happened. And this is eugenics. This is not to mince words. This is eugenics. This is selectively letting people live and die based on these particular traits or disabilities or impairments and things like that, because you do not deem their quality of life and their personhood to be equal and equitable. So we're going to talk about prison and the carceral system. Prison is awful, right? Jails are awful, prison's awful. Oftentimes, it's hard to tell the difference between the two because one is supposed to be short-term, one is supposed to be more long-term, and the systems just do what they want, checked or unchecked. Oftentimes, whether they're private or whether they're not private, they will often do whatever they want. So disability is seen as something that is very criminalized, and it always has been. If you look at media, we look at mental health as something that's criminalized. Like, for instance, I had students who were talking about the Joker and how this one girl's boyfriend, he thought it was an interesting film, but she's like, that's not mental health. Mental health doesn't actually look like people with mental health issues are not these violent vigilantes who commit these crimes and do awful things and things like that. Most often, people who have mental health issues are the victims of these crimes or victims of abuse. There was a person who was in, people called the police, he was having a schizophrenic episode, and he knew he was, so he was taking a shower. And the police broke into his house, and then he flicks water at them because he's like, is this real? Is this not real? And then they killed him because they're seeing him as a threat, right? So people with mental health or cognitive disabilities are often villainized, and they're seen as just overly aggressive, extremely dangerous, and they need to be contained, right? And that kind of containment often comes in the form of institutions or prisons. So there are more, just in terms of percentage wise, disabled people are overrepresented in prison. So about 38%, and this is older data, so this is clearly gone up. 38% of people in prisons have disabilities, have some kind of disability, whether it's ambulatory, mental health, cognitive, what have you, have a disability, rather than like 15 to 20% of like the general population. So many of these people who have cognitive and mental health related disabilities, there were services they needed, these services have been closed, or they have been denied these services, and this is where they have ended up. They have ended up in this particular system of containment, of housing, of punishment. So their disabilities are not only criminalized, but they're punished, right? They're denied the services they need, and they are punished for having a disability. So there are also many disabled people who are maimed or killed when police are called. So one big problem is because when you call 911, oftentimes, I know this happens all over New York. I have been to different places in New York. I know it does also happen in other places as well. Instead of like EMTs coming, the police will be there. My brother's girlfriend had to go to the hospital, and I had to call 911. And I live near the hospital. We couldn't carry her. She needed to literally be put onto a stretcher and carried to the hospital in an ambulance. And it's funny that there's an ambulance going by, but I live near a hospital and a police station and a fire station, ironically enough. And before they got there, the police were there for about 15 minutes asking her, "What's wrong? Where do you live? Who did this to you?" She's like, "No one did anything to me. I'm sick. I need help. There's something wrong. I need to go to a doctor to figure out what's wrong." But she can barely talk. And I'm like, "Why are you harassing her? Like, we're literally holding her on the ground because we can't lift her." And they come and then they eventually leave. And then EMT comes 20, 30 minutes later. Right. So when that happens, when health services, mental or otherwise, are needed, and you have the police who show up who are not trained at all to deal with this. This is what they know. This is what they do. But hospitals can be disabling too. We're not getting into that. But prisons are also disabling because they have unsafe and unhealthy conditions. Spoiled food. You will often find that. I know I'm not going to mention the company because I don't want to get sued, but there was a company that was just known that the food was either almost bad or bad, or they'll just give you food that's moldy. There's unsanitary conditions that affect or will worsen whatever condition you might have, having mold or other things that just aren't clean, things that are broken. I know when there were floods in different states, people were up to their waist in water, just standing water, and they were trapped in prison. So when these disasters happen all over the country, when you think about snowstorms or hurricanes, tornadoes, think about the fact that many prisons, while they're supposed to have evacuation systems, prisoners will often be left in their cells to their own devices with little to no food, little to no resources. Some are left without heat or without electricity, right? Because of the way in which we see the carceral system as punishing justifiable people, where a lot of people are just there's a lot of people waiting to be sentenced, or they have not been sentenced with a violent crime. And even if they did, this dehumanization of bodies, a decent amount of whom are disabled, is a huge miscarriage of justice. And I know we're kind of getting long in here, but still. Civilian food access. This is my wheelhouse. So many of the things I talk about are food sovereignty, food justice, and food waste. I don't know why I'm clapping. I talk with my hands. I'm a New Yorker. So food sovereignty is the right of people to determine their own foods and to determine the extent in which they want to be self-reliant. So if you want, people to help feed you or to help get you food or make you food, that's fine. You're still defined as a person, a human being. You still have that right. It's about your rights, your choices, to be able to define what you want and need and have culturally competent food. So food justice is kind of that pathway to it. So it addresses the injustices, right? And they disproportionately impact people based on race, class. Those are traditional areas. More people are looking at gender, of course, war, climate change, but a lot of my things look at disability. So food waste would be the eating habits, culinary practices of people, region, or kind of historically things. But these movements will often leave out disability. So what does a disabled food way look like? What does a disabled person, how are they getting food from, not just from someone who picked it up from the farm, right, from the farmer to their table, but what about the farming practice? Farming practices can be inaccessible to people who want to plant, but also can be disabling to people. There was a company that I was getting food from. They gave you food that people didn't want. It was one of those companies. And I opened up a box of, I think it was a cabbage or lettuce, and it had soot all over it from the wildfires that were happening in California. So they were okay with taking food from people who literally they didn't even have, say, bandanas on, picking vegetables, food all day in the sun, in the soot that is coming down on them, to sell to me at a discounted rate. And I could not stand that. I could not stand that they were supporting in any way these disabling conditions. So I stopped supporting them. I told people, other people stopped supporting them. I don't know if they've changed anything, but I know that I find ways to not support that, right? But also ways to ensure that disabled people have access to farming, have access to control what they're putting into the ground and what they're putting into their bodies from the very beginning, to the transportation system, to the food choices they make at the supermarket, to their cooking abilities and choices, and to what they're eating. So things to think about are, how do disabled people shop? When you go to the supermarket, do you see disabled people shopping? How are they shopping? Do people make fun of them? I've seen so many memes where people make fun of somebody with, especially an ambulatory disability, reaching up to grab something like, oh, now you can walk. It's not that they couldn't walk, it's that they may have issues walking. Like, that's not, there's no be all end all, like, you can either walk or you can't walk. You can fully see or you're fully blind. You can fully hear, you're fully deaf. That's not how things work. They're on spectrums and scales, and people reducing disabled people and saying, oh, if you can walk, then you're faking, or if you can walk, then do you really need this, is also harmful. How do different people with different disabilities shop? If someone has sensitivity to light and sound, a supermarket with bright lights and loud music is not going to be helpful. It's not going to encourage them to shop. They're not going to be able to shop. Do they need help? Is customer service actually there to help people? Sometimes you can call ahead and someone will actually be there, but oftentimes you will call customer service when you get there. If they can't pull someone off the floor, then you can't shop. And if you got paratransit, they're gonna leave you. They're gonna come back at a certain time, and you're ready or not, they'll wait maybe 5 minutes and then they're leaving, and that's it. But do they even want help? Some people do want help. Some people don't like when you say, "Do you need help? Do you need help? Do you need help?" No, they want to shop alone, peace and quiet and private. But yeah, also the services to assist people. Are there ways in which people can even read or look at the signs without needing help? Are the shelves height appropriate? If you go to a supermarket, traditionally the more expensive stuff is at like height, like if you're sitting or at some kind of level, the cheaper things are either on the bottom or on the top, which is hard to reach depending on your disability or your needs. Or someone shopping for you, like you have a grocery delivery service and someone's making that choice, they may just be just pulling whatever off the shelves. They're not thinking about what you can or can't afford. They're like, oh, you need cereal? Here is cereal. You need this, you need that. That's also something else. Are they reliable? Sometimes they're not. Sometimes the substitutions you get, depending on the store you go to, I have often gotten food that was past its expiration date by weeks because it wasn't rotated on the shelf, or they just threw it there and they didn't care, right? It wasn't food for them. So who cares, right? How are people getting there? Is the route accessible? What does accessibility mean? Accessibility is different for everyone. Don't think it's one catch-all term. Don't think it just means someone who is in a wheelchair, someone who is blind, someone who is deaf. There's a huge array of disability conditions and categories, and we need to think about all of those when we are thinking about what disabled people need, want, and desire. And also asking them, like, they know, they know the answer to a lot of these questions, and often, we just need to listen and enact the solutions. So, in conclusion, right, disabled people and their body minds, that's a term that's often used, often invisibilized in many institutions and systems because the fear of disablement is critical to keeping these systems running, specifically the carceral system. You can look at other systems, but the carceral system is a really big one that has a really kind of more aware example. Ideas around normalcy and how disabled people should function, or how normal people should function, often mean that those outside of this kind of normal bell curve are either demonized, infantilized, and left vulnerable to predatory systems like sheltered workshops. Centering disabled people in conversations around health and equity are really important because they're often left out of their conversations, but they know what their needs are. So one of the articles that I did send was about how disabled people were left out of the food justice movement because they're seen as not fit enough to participate, not decision makers to participate, but also people who are larger with disabilities are seen as, you made this bad health decision that led to your disability, which is often not the case. But even if it was, it doesn't matter. They should still be part of equitable conversations around food justice. So you will see some food justice movements that are about a particular type of body or a particular type of size, a particular type of cooking or eating. You will see sustainability movements. Often the same thing. I do a lot of things around pre-cut food, and people say, "Oh, that's awful and that's wasteful and that's lazy." And but that if something that's fresh is not pre-cut, some people won't be able to eat it. They'll have to eat frozen or they'll have to eat canned. And even if those are accessible to them, they want to have options because you want to have options, because we all want options. We all want to be treated like consumers, right? Like active buyers and consumers, not just passive consumers. Someone's going to feed this to me, kind of at the end of the foodways or the end of the food system. So these were my sources, and there was an activity, and I do believe Zoe has a copy of that. Or no, if you don't, I have it.
Yes, we were going to do that with the students in this later
Yes.
half of the class.
But yeah, so if anyone has any questions, if anyone, my cats are, I have 3 cats and they're just everywhere now. But if anyone has any questions, I will stop my share and, take any questions that people might have. I will also put my email in the chat. So this is just my email. Hope I'm doing it right. Nope, I did not do it right. I know I did. I typed it right. I always get the @ and the dot confused. I'm very sorry. And then this is my personal email. If you just want to chat more, or if you have a place you want me to speak at, just let me know. I'm very open and flexible, and I absolutely love speaking about different things related to disability and equity and, reform and revolution,
So if anybody wants to raise their hand, then we can do that. But we also have some from the chat that we can start with. So first is just kind of like a broad question, but can you just expand on the different types of disabilities and which disabilities specifically face the most barriers in accessing healthy food? So which disabilities have the highest levels of food insecurity?
I think it's interesting because a lot of people, I think it depends on where you live, to be honest, because you will have, okay, so there's ambulatory disabilities, which are generally kind of more physical. So, people to walk or write or things like that are kind of more visible. Then you will have mental health disabilities that affect your mind. So perhaps depression, anxiety, having panic attacks, schizophrenia, being bipolar or manic. You have cognitive disabilities. So people who are, for instance, people who have, God, why am I just mentioned the term earlier. So people who have Down syndrome, other types of cognitive abilities, or their cognitive abilities to understand certain things is diminished compared to what non-disabled people's cognitive abilities are. So that's just kind of one of many. And there are people who break those up into different groups. And you will see a high representation of, physical disabilities in these conversations. One of the many reasons is because of IRB and the Institutional Review Board. It is much more difficult to interview people with cognitive disability. So disabled people is hard to interview because they are protected class, because they have been subject to so much experimentation and wrongful, harmful experiments and investigations and research. But people with cognitive disabilities is another barrier, because some people with cognitive disabilities, not all, have guardianship. So you would have to go through the guardian and you would get consent from the guardian, but there's also something called assent, which is pretty much getting consent from someone, so a form of consent from someone who cannot legally consent. So you would still try to get assent, but that's kind of more difficult. It's not more difficult if you know how to do that research or you have a mentor. So if you want to do research with people with more like cognitive disabilities, that is definitely something you should look into, finding a mentor who knows how to do that. And there are 2 people in disability studies, Kate Caldwell and Sarah Parker Harris, who do a lot of work around that. And so they would definitely be the people to speak to if you want to do more work on that. And I can give you their emails if you want to ask them more about that. About how to go about that with IRB or other things like that. And so even though physical disabilities, we kind of see them represented a lot, all disabilities are impacted by food access issues, because it impacts mental health, physical health, and it just brings a detriment to whatever disabilities were already existing or impairments were already existing in the body, and the disabilities that were existing outside of the body, and disablement and barriers. So I do think in research, you do have this high representation of people with physical disabilities, but then you will have mental health, and then cognitive disabilities. Like I said, those are harder to get to, but there is research about that too. It's just more difficult to access that.
Sorry, struggle to find the mute button. Great. So the next question that I have is kind of a mouthful, so I'll also put it in the chat. But how can the public health field reframe discourse around disease in a manner that doesn't oppress people who are disabled? Furthermore, how do we remove the stigmatizing judgment, example, abnormal or bad, inherent in our conception of disease, while simultaneously striving to improve population health? Is it harmful to say that certain diseases legitimately contribute to premature mortality or diminished quality of life?
Mhm.
If not, how do we communicate that without causing additional structural violence?
That is amazing. I think one great thing is to remember a person is not their disease. A person is not solely their disability. So there are some people who want to be called disabled, right? They want to be called a disabled person, especially people who are autistic person. People who have other disabilities, they may not be. They maybe want to be called a person with a disability, a person who is XYZ rather than disabled and then person. And so that depends, that framing of how they want to see themselves, you would ask that person, how do you want to see yourselves? But a person is not a disease, right? Someone may have diabetes, but that's not their entire life. That is not their entire disease. I actually was, and I'm not a very religious person. I was actually reading about, there's this, person that was in the Bible and they had this issue, right? And everybody, like no one even knows her name because they just associated her with this impairment that she had so strongly that that was her whole identity. And that is something that needs to be stopped. Of course, you can say these things diminish quality of life, but that's not the only thing that is diminishing their quality of life, right? So someone who may have, heart disease, clearly that's diminishing their quality of life, but what kind of care are they getting? What kind of education do they have or do they get around the foods and things they need? Is it culturally competent? Because oftentimes that's not the case either. If you're telling someone that they need to do this and they have no idea what you're talking about or no idea how to handle this, and you just wash your hands of them because you're the professional and what's best, that paternality will turn people off and they will just not listen and their quality of life will continue to diminish. But also just thinking about the structures that are in place that are also contributing to that diminished quality of life is important. Environmental, social, psychological, financial, health structures. So I think that's one of the things about that. And, like I said, if you have a colleague or someone that is saying something, oh my goodness, this person who's diabetic, they're just ridiculous and they just won't listen and they just want to be lazy and fat. No, you stop that. You cut that off, no matter who that is, right? I have had arguments and conversations, sometimes arguments, with other people about their language, terminology, how they're seeing a person. I know, especially people with type 2 diabetes, they're seen as causing their own disablement over someone, for instance, with type 1 because of how that's just portrayed, right? And you stop that. You stop it where it starts, right? It starts with you, obviously, but if you see that behavior happening, you stop it. Because that person that's saying it to you may be saying it to a patient or to another care, someone in their care, and that is also diminishing their quality of life. And I think using a lot of plain language summaries, I'm very into plain language. I love infographics. Oh my goodness, I love infographics so much. That is a really good way of reaching people through not just language, but through symbols. I know someone who did a COVID, they did when COVID was first coming out and all this information was coming out from the CDC and some things were hard to translate. They had a sheet where they broke everything down into plain language. What is a virus? What does hand washing do? They had images. It wasn't just like pictures, like it was like hand-drawn images of what to do each step of the way. And the language was so easy to read and understand. It was easy to translate into other languages. So it could be translated into Spanish, which a lot of Spanish people, people who spoke Spanish primarily, it was hard for translators there weren't enough translators or there weren't enough things in information that they could understand or read. That is still happening in other communities because, it's hard to reach certain communities, but having things like that, making them easy to translate into other languages or translate concepts, that is definitely going to communicate that. I think that's really important.
Great, thank you. So we're just about at time. So if we just want to give one more last virtual round of applause to our speaker, Ms. Washieka Torres. This was really great, so important, so informative. We really thank you for having us and speaking with us. As always, thank you everyone for joining us. We hope to see you next week. And like I said, happy Black History Month and happy Lunar New Year to everyone.
Okay, bye. If you have any additional questions, like I said, my email was in the chat. And yeah, it was great being able to communicate with you all.